Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I would like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. Today, we plan to discuss simulation from an industry perspective. I have the distinct honor of interviewing Doug Beighle, who serves as the President and Chief Operating Officer for Simulab Corporation and former Society for Simulation and Healthcare board member, or SSH. He currently serves on the board for the Global Network for Simulation and Healthcare, or GNSH. Doug, it's an honor to interview you today.
Well, Jeff, it's great to be here.
So, Doug, we usually start our podcast with a little bit of background about the individual we're interviewing. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got started in simulation?
Well, I have a background in computer hardware and manufacturing, and right after the big internet meltdown of 2001, I was introduced to Chris Tolley, who is the founder and the CEO and the CTO of Simulab. And since then, it's been over 20 years, Chris and I have made great partners, and through him, I actually fell in love with simulation. You know, every single day we hear how our customers about positive impact our products have had on healthcare outcomes. And it's easy to get out of bed every single morning and come to work with that kind of impact. So 20 years later, we're still hard at it and our work's not done.
I think you once told me a story about how you got involved and how one of your early products was Trauma Man and how that impacted the field. And that was really the beginnings of how Chris Tolley and maybe his wife would actually go in and make these mannequins themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In the early days, it was a small company. And so 25 years ago, we responded as a company to the need of laparoscopic surgeons to create a training vehicle for general surgeons to learn laparoscopic surgery. So Chris created all sorts of phantoms for them to practice with and box trainers and things like that, which led to our customers saying, well, if you can make all these fantastic soft tissue models, can you make this and can you make that? Which eventually led to a call from the American College of Surgeons, an open call to the industry to say we need a product called Trauma Man to replace the use of pigs and cadavers in advanced trauma and life support, ATLS, worldwide. And Trauma Man became the first recognized and accepted product for the Surgical Skills Lab all the way back in 2002.
And is it true that Chris was actually and his wife were actually in the factory building them, or is that a wives' tale?
Oh, no, they were in the early days. It was a small crew. We're a much larger company now.
Yeah, so tell me about the 5-minute overview of Simulab today and how big the corporation has grown.
So we're a 25-year-old company, like I was saying. We're based in Seattle, Washington, and we are privately held, and we have no outside partners, debt, or investors. So it's kind of a great American story of a grassroots company that just continues to grow. We have over 100 employees. People always ask us, where do we fit into the grand scheme of simulation? We fill a niche that is we make the finest soft tissue models in the industry, and we really focus on tissue emulation. And so our goal is to create tissues that look, feel, cut, tear, bleed, ultrasound, and even conduct like human tissue. And so that has all sorts of ramifications within healthcare simulation, but that's the lane of the freeway that we call simulation that we fill.
And here I am as a executive director of a simulation center, having a conversation with an individual that works for industry. And admittingly, if you asked me if I'd be doing that 10 years ago, I would have said, no, that's a conflict of interest. But it's really not, because as you're going to see through the podcast, as Doug and I keep talking, there is an important partnership between the sim labs that are running and the industry individuals that bring to light some of the products that we need. And one of the things you mentioned is that there was a call from the American College of Surgeons for a product they needed, and you answered that call. The same kind of issue has come up again where we have needed products to fill a need for us, and Simulab was able to create the simulators that we wanted. So let's talk a little bit about how industry can solve some of the problems that healthcare is facing today. And specifically, again, you talked about Trauma Man and how it reduced the use of cadavers and animals. But what other problems do you see that you're answering the call to help healthcare improve their quality and safety?
That's a great question, Jeff, and I'm going to try to unpack about 5 questions within that question. So what we do as a company is we listen to our customers and we amalgamate everything that they ask for. So as Northwestern would be asking for something, generally that's been asked by many customers around the world for something very similar. And what the specific educational needs may be different. And so we have to amalgamate those into how do we make a product that meets all those people's needs? And then how do we fit that into our product horizon? So I always tell people, that's a great idea for a product and a need. I understand that, but it may not be today. But then eventually things make it to the today, and we build it to meet educators' needs. And we have collaborative partners all over the world that have specific needs, and we really ask them to focus on what is your training need and what are the exact specifications you need in simulation to accomplish those needs. And those needs have really shifted as the industry's matured. In the beginning, it was build us the simplest, least expensive product possible. And now it really is moved to build us the product that is the most realistic, that has the lowest cost of total life. So that's, how much would that product cost us to train hundreds of people over a 10-year period? And then how do we immerse the users, which is the educator and the student, in the best simulation possible for the best value? And I know that sounds really complicated because there is a lot of trade-offs in a great simulation product. We always say that there are competing forces of fidelity and cost, and then usability. And so how do you make this product so it's a perfect balance for someone's budget? And when you originally asked this question, I said I was going to unpack the question in parts. To answer your big picture question, which is how do our products fit into the big picture of patient safety and improving patient outcomes, we are told, and it's been published in papers, how our products have directly contributed to a reduction of errors and improved outcomes in a number of the procedures where our products apply.
And there's multiple examples of that personally, through our collaboration with you from Northwestern, trying to help improve central line man, for instance. We've done a whole slew of studies, as most of our listeners know, with central line man, showing that it improves clinical outcomes. But also we've done several needs assessments at our institution and found, for instance, that our ER physicians were getting variable exposure to temporary pacing. So in collaboration with Simulab created a wonderful model that allows the user to practice inserting a temporary pacer wire and setting it up and getting feedback from the simulator. And that model also doubles as a pulmonary artery catheter simulator. So there's some wonderful products that have come out of needs assessments. And I'm sure there's countless examples even outside of the collaboration we've done with Simulab here at Northwestern. But that's a perfect example of how partnerships between industry and hospitals and simulation labs are important.
I agree. And the Pacerman, which you're referring to in that discussion, is a perfect example of great simulation where the procedure is highly critical, it's infrequently done, and it has an elaborate number of steps, and the equipment necessary is a little cumbersome. And so to practice frequently so that when somebody is called on to do temporary transvenous pacing, they can actually do it in a timely manner without having to seek consult.
So for our listeners, I think it's important also to realize that we can't just go to Simulab and say, build this product for us. In fact, there are ideas that we've had based on our needs for other products that Simulab has said, respectfully, that's not in our vision right now. Come back later, or let's discuss it at a later time because we don't have the bandwidth right now. So how do you kind of weigh that in for those that may consider a collaboration on a product that they feel they really need in their institution? How do you decide which ones you move forward on?
Well, it's not a perfect science, but the good thing is that we find that the medical education community is extremely generous with their willing to have a discussion and their thoughtfulness around this. So when we put together our product timeline, we discuss it with a number of people around the world and say, hey, this is the next thing that we're going to be making, and the one after that. Would that be the same priorities that you'd have within your simulation lab? And once we reach a consensus, then we move forward.
Doug, we've had a collaboration together for years now. I can't even think back to when we first met and started collaborating. What makes our collaboration and your willingness to work with Northwestern Simulation so special? Because I know you always have told me that you really enjoy working with Northwestern and creating products with our physicians. So, what advice can you give that sparks that for you, for other people that might be listening and want the same sort of relationship with an industry partner?
That's a really good question. And the first part of it is Northwestern, you've done a great job systematically creating curriculum. And so by doing that, you stayed, when I would say, in the niche that the simulation lab should stay in, which is you're all about teaching students and creating curriculum and not building simulation and bringing it to us and saying, we'd like to license to you this simulator. Because that it's usually not industrialized and ready for production, and we'd have to unwind it anyway. But really looking at the needs of the curriculum and the educator and the student and coming to us with what the simulation should do instead of how the simulation should be built is the first part of it that has made you a good partner. There's two other parts that I want to touch base on. The mastery-based learning model that you subscribe to really looks at the entire educational continuum and not just novices to competency. And we believe that that's a really important piece of simulation in the long term. And so we've thought you've made a good partner because your vision and your leadership in that area. The other part is your understanding of the resources necessary to create and implement great simulation. The groundbreaking paper on return on investment that really brings the entire C-suite into play to look at what is the true value of what simulation is doing for a hospital or hospital system, is speaking to the needs and the resources like a business person. And that was a very attractive from a business standpoint is, hey, this is someone who gets it. And so that probably was the pivotal reason we started a partner. And then the second two things we just talked about became the reason that we're long-term partners.
And the paper you're referring to is by my colleague, Elaine Cohen, published in the journal done by the Society for Simulation in Healthcare. And it was a demonstration study of using central line man to reduce central line associated bloodstream infections and the return on investment that resulted from it. And when you mentioned the C-suite or the executive suite, yes, it got their attention, and we don't ever have to worry about getting funding for this important initiative to continue central line training. Pretty much all of our clinicians go through it in one way or the other when they rotate through the ICUs at Northwestern. So that was, thanks for bringing that up. That brings back some good memories. And in fact, we're still doing the training. I still do that training today.
So in 2008, when I read this paper, and I read a ton of papers that are published specifically on simulation, when I read this, my mind was blown. So I bought copies and was willing to give that away to anyone that would read that paper and understand that story, because I thought it was the single most powerful principle in simulation, and I still believe it is. I still believe that resources is the biggest factor for holding back simulation from moving forward. It's not technology, it's not people, it's not curriculum, it's resources.
So that's the perfect segue into my next question, because you're getting there right now. So you talk about resources. Is that the major barrier to growth of healthcare simulation, or is it something else?
Yes, it's resources, which is not just money. It's also people and time and commitment. So if you have the greatest program in the world and the nurses don't have paid time to come down to see training, then it's an ineffective program. But then how do you get the resources, and how do you turn, it's kind of spin that back into a question, how do you turn simulation into a value provider instead of an expense line within your healthcare system or within your nursing school, within your fire department? How do you show value to all stakeholders? And for people that are not used to showing value, it's a difficult proposition, which starts with understanding the language of the different stakeholders and getting them involved and then getting them to buy in.
One of the most profound things we talk about is when we go to sim labs, and this is dear to your heart, we ask often to groups we talk to, how many of you know what your hospital's biggest problems are? How many of you have talked to your executive suite or C-suite? How many of you have gone to your departments of quality and safety and said, what keeps you up at night and how can I help be a part of solution? And that's really eye-opening, because that's where you get the return on investment from simulation. And you can help the most people, because certainly each hospital or healthcare system has unique struggles from others. Maybe one is having issues with central line infections, and maybe a product like Central Line Man is part of the solution. Others may be having problems in other areas. And it's so important really to know what problems you're trying to solve. Sometimes it may not even be about the hospital's problem. It may be about your students' biggest issues. And that helps to build the university's reputation and the medical school or the nursing school's reputation of a place where people want to go and hire nurses from, which also has its own return on investment, whether it's maybe a little bit more intangible than the hospital costs for the schools. So it's near and dear to both of us. And Bill McGahee, my colleague, always described that as a translational outcome, a T4 outcome, because showing that it affects the bottom line in healthcare, the return on investment, is one of the most powerful outcomes that exist.
If you want to get all the stakeholders involved and get the resources, that is very important.
So, Doug, you talked about the barriers being resources, more like time and financial commitment. But what about the technology? There's naysayers out there that say, oh, it's never going to be like a real patient, and they have a point there. But do you think the realism and fidelity are holding back the growth of simulation?
There is that perception, especially on from the educator standpoint.
When we look at the airplane simulators and we compare the realism and fidelity of those to what we have currently in medical simulation, and we compare the realism and fidelity of what we have in healthcare simulation, mannequins and equipment, it's night and day. You get on an airplane simulator, it's like you're in the cockpit, the plane is moving, you have all the haptic technology. And our technology, we're just starting to dabble in augmented reality and virtual reality and mixed reality simulator. But talk to me about where you think this technology is going, and what are you most excited about?
I'm going to answer the first part. Back in 2001, I flew in a Boeing 737 flight simulator. And they excused all the on-screen and the visuals as being very rudimentary. And it was nothing like the real thing. but it was the best they had at the time. And so now fast forward 21 years later, I think that they actually have changed that, and it is high fidelity. Our industry, I think, suffers from the same thing, is that we still are just a micro business in comparison to what it should be. When we're really solving the needs of healthcare, streamlining healthcare education, creating better predictable outcomes, reducing patient errors, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar problem in the United States that healthcare simulation could really help solve, that we aren't even scratching at that. And once the resources are there, you're going to see the simulation will follow. And the fidelity of the simulation will fall because it'll be a multi-billion-dollar industry, which it is not today. And so rarely do we see technology lead and bring resources. It generally, technology follows resources. And so that's what we're waiting. It's a little bit of the cart and the buggy, where the simulation is a little still the buggy.
So what's the next best technology that's going to come out in your mind? What's happening? Where are we moving forward to?
So I think recently we're seeing a lot of excitement around virtual environments. So whether it's screen-based, mobile-based, or headset-based virtual environments for team education, for changing scenarios, decisions on the fly, we're seeing a lot of venture capital activity and backing of new companies and startups. I think that's important. We'll see who's the eventual winners and losers in that category. So I think that's finally come to a tipping point where we've had discussions around that technology for 20 years. But at Simulab, we are looking at things in a very practical standpoint. We always have been a practical company. We've always had the technology to have our simulators talk back to the educator and the student and give them some quality metrics back. But the industry hasn't really been ready for it. So where we've used, and I think that technology will be soon, but it really requires the requirement for assessment. People aren't really ready for that yet. But where we're taking our technology now is improving the usability and fidelity of the simulation through, in areas like you turn on a simulation, it runs the entire thing. It has variability to it, so you can customize it, make it so that it is a different patient every time, that it really takes the variability out of the training. And so we're creating the beginnings of what we call smart task trainers.
So, Doug, I wanted to ask you one more question before I think we have to start wrapping up. But what keeps you up at night? What are your biggest concerns as you run your company?
The first off is currently there's global supply chain issues. We're really lucky at Simulab. We're a vertically integrated manufacturer, and we actually, most of our products start with the raw components, and we build from there. We do buy a lot of electronic parts that we've seen supply chain issues, but just small things like cases that our products ship in. And there's been some real weakness in both the global supply chain, but also in the global transportation supply chain. So even if the product's ready, is getting it shipped to us is a problem. But that's a very tactical issue, which is and I believe a short-term issue. And I believe that from Simulab's standpoint, we're dealing with it in a microcosm in comparison to many companies in our industry and globally in all industries. But I like to always think in terms of further down the road. And so the reason I lose sleep at night is not necessarily worrying, but it's also somewhat dreaming, is how do we help take our company and simulation forward? So every single day we become a more global company. And so I have a 5-year path to help us become a more global company. We've changed a lot of our products so they better are meeting the needs of a global community. And we're going to move resources closer and closer to those end users throughout the world as our company expands globally. And that takes a lot of planning and logistics, and but I'm also excited about it.
Well, the long-term future of simulation is certainly bright, and as I like to say, this too shall pass with the supply chain issues eventually. And with everything that is coming forth that we talked about, I think there's a lot of really neat things to come, and a lot of patients are going to be helped in the future. We always see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. That's why it's so much fun to talk to you about these things. So thanks for actually coming today to do this interview with me.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Thanks. It's great to be here. I feel like I'm the luckiest guy on the planet, and our customers all throughout the world are so smart, committed, and generous. And together, over the next, indeterminate number of years, we're going to make a huge impact working together. And I'm super excited about that and committed to it. So here's to many, many more years of doing great work.
All right. Thank you for listening today. In our next series of podcasts, we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.